The summer heat in Austin, Texas was unrelenting as George Strait pulled his black F-150 into the parking lot of Molly's Roadhouse, a local establishment that had been serving authentic Texas barbecue for over 30 years. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he stepped out of the air-conditioned cab, the asphalt radiating heat through the soles of his hand-crafted boots. At 69 years old, the country music legend still cut an impressive figure in his starched button-down shirt and well-worn jeans, his silver hair peeking out from beneath his signature resistol cowboy hat. "Been looking forward to this all week," George muttered to himself as he locked his truck and headed toward the entrance, the aroma of smoked brisket and mesquite already teasing his senses. Inside, Molly's was bustling with the typical Friday lunch crowd. Waitresses in blue jeans and flannel shirts navigated between wooden tables, carrying trays loaded with plates of ribs, pulled pork, and the house specialty, slow-cooked beef brisket. Country music played softly through the speakers, ironically one of George's own classics, Amarillo by Morning. The hostess, a young woman named Amber with auburn hair tied back in a ponytail, did a double-take as George approached the counter. Her eyes widened in recognition, but to her credit, she maintained her professional composure. "Welcome to Molly's, sir. Table for one?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Yes, ma'am. Somewhere quiet if you've got it," George replied with the polite, soft-spoken manner that had endeared him to fans for decades. Amber led him to a corner booth, partially obscured by a decorative divider adorned with vintage license plates and weathered rodeo posters. "Your server will be right with you," she said, handing him a laminated menu. "It's an honor to have you here, Mr. Strait." George smiled warmly. "Appreciate that. Heard you folks have the best brisket in Travis County." As Amber walked away, whispers began to ripple through the restaurant. Diners cast furtive glances his way, some nudging their companions and pointing discreetly. George was accustomed to the attention after nearly 4 decades in the spotlight, but he'd always valued his privacy, especially during simple pleasures like enjoying a good meal. A middle-aged waitress with Denise embroidered on her shirt approached his table, notepad in hand, unable to conceal her excitement. "Mr. Strait, I can't believe you're actually here. My husband and I have seen you in concert 12 times. Your music got us through some real tough times." "Well, that's mighty kind of you to say," George replied, genuinely touched. "Happy to hear my songs meant something to you folks." After taking his order, brisket with coleslaw, beans and cornbread, Denise reluctantly left to put it in. George settled into the comfortable booth, scrolling through messages on his phone while waiting for his meal. "So the king of country decides to grace us with his presence," the suited man said loudly, his voice carrying across the now hushed restaurant. George looked up, surprised by the confrontational tone. "Excuse me?" "Richard, please," the manager pleaded quietly. "This isn't the place." The man, Richard, ignored him. "You don't remember me, do you, Strait?" He planted his hands on George's table, leaning forward. "Richard Kelton. My daddy owned Kelton Recording Studios in Nashville, 1988. He was scheduled to meet with his band later that afternoon to rehearse for an upcoming benefit concert at the Irwin Center, raising funds for Texas ranchers affected by the recent drought. The peaceful moment was short-lived. A tall, broad-shouldered man in an expensive suit approached George's table, his face flushed with what appeared to be agitation. Behind him trailed a nervous-looking man in his 30s, wearing a Molly's manager name tag. "You were supposed to record your album with us, then backed out last minute for a bigger label, broke my old man's heart and damn near bankrupted him." George's expression shifted from confusion to recognition, then to genuine concern. "Mr. Kelton, I'm sorry about your father's business. That was a complicated situation with the label, not a decision I made lightly." "Save it," Richard snapped. Your complicated situation cost my family everything. Dad drank himself to death within 2 years. He straightened up, adjusting his tie. Now look at you, eating barbecue while people still worship the ground you walk on. Makes me sick. The restaurant manager stepped forward. Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to return to your table. It's all right, George said calmly. I understand he's upset. Richard's face darkened. Upset? You think this is just being upset? He reached for George's glass of ice water and before anyone could react, dumped it into the singer's lap. Gasps echoed throughout the restaurant. George stood quickly, water dripping from his jeans, his expression a mixture of shock and restraint. That's what my family got from you, left out in the cold, Richard said, his voice trembling with decades of pent-up resentment. The manager moved swiftly now, signaling to a waiter to call security. That's enough. You need to leave now, Mr. Kelton. Richard stood his ground. I'm one of your biggest investors. You telling me you're choosing him over me? The manager hesitated, visibly uncomfortable with the dilemma. George, still maintaining his composure despite his wet clothes, raised a hand. No need for all this, I'll go. He reached for his wallet, placing some bills on the table. For the meal I didn't get to enjoy. Mr. Strait, please, the manager began. You don't have to. It's all right, son. Some days just don't go as planned. With dignity intact, George started toward the exit. Richard called after him, That's right, walk away. It's what you're good at. The restaurant remained eerily silent as the country music legend pushed through the door and back into the sweltering Texas heat, leaving behind a restaurant full of shocked patrons and one bitterly satisfied Richard Kelton. As George reached his truck, he paused for a moment, removing his hat and wiping his brow. The incident had shaken him more than he cared to admit, not because of the public embarrassment, but because buried in Richard Kelton's accusations was a kernel of truth that had haunted him for years. Decisions made in pursuit of success sometimes came at a cost to others he'd never fully acknowledged. He climbed into his truck, started the engine, and sat there for a moment, gazing at the restaurant through the windshield. After a thoughtful pause, he pulled out his phone and dialed a familiar number. Hey, it's George, he said when the call connected. We need to talk about something important. George's black F-150 rumbled down the long gravel driveway leading to his ranch just outside San Antonio. The property stretched for hundreds of acres, a sanctuary he'd built over decades of music success, far enough from the city for privacy, but close enough to stay connected to the industry when needed. As he pulled up to the sprawling single-story ranch house with its wide porch and rocking chairs, his wife Norma stepped outside, clearly concerned by his early return. "George," she called, shielding her eyes from the afternoon sun. "Thought you had rehearsal in Austin today." He shut off the engine and climbed out, his jeans now mostly dry but still bearing the evidence of the earlier confrontation. "Had a bit of an incident at lunch," he replied, climbing the porch steps to kiss her cheek. "Thought I'd come home, change, and sort some things out before meeting the boys." Inside the cool interior of their home, decorated with a tasteful blend of classic Western furnishings and family photos accumulated over their 48 years of marriage, George recounted the restaurant encounter while changing into fresh clothes. Norma sat on the edge of their bed, listening attentively. At 67, her face showed the gentle lines of a life well lived, her grey-streaked hair framing features that still lit up when she smiled, though she wasn't smiling now. "Kelton," she repeated, trying to place the name. "From Nashville? That was so long ago, George." 33 years, he confirmed, buttoning a fresh shirt, but apparently not long enough for some wounds to heal. "You can't blame yourself for what happened to his father," Norma insisted. "Those were business decisions the label made. You were just starting to get real traction in your career." George sighed, sitting beside her on the bed. Maybe so, but I could have fought harder for that small studio. I knew old man Kelton was struggling. I got caught up in the momentum of everything happening with MCA at the time. Norma placed a hand on his. You've always been too hard on yourself, you know that? You can't carry the weight of how everyone's life turned out. Can't I, though? He asked quietly. When my decisions played a part. Before Norma could respond, George's phone rang. He checked the screen. It's Tom, he said, referring to Tom Hammond, his longtime manager and friend. I called him after it happened. He answered, putting the call on speaker. Hey, Tom. George, I've been making some calls. Tom's gravelly voice came through. This Richard Kelton character, he's had a chip on his shoulder about you for years. Apparently, he mentions you in his business circles whenever your name comes up, never in a flattering way. He's done pretty well for himself, despite what happened with his dad's studio. Real estate mostly. Some restaurant investments. Like Molly's, George added. Exactly. He owns a 30% stake in 6 locations across Texas. Look, George, do you want me to handle this? We could have our PR team put out a statement. Maybe have a word with the restaurant management about how their investor treated you. George exchanged a glance with Norma, who shook her head slightly. She knew her husband well enough to recognize he wouldn't want to escalate the situation publicly. No statements, George confirmed. That'll just make it worse. But I want to know more about Kelton Studios and what really happened back then. Can you pull those old contracts? And maybe reach out discreetly to some folks who were around Nashville in those days. Sure thing, Tom replied. But what are you thinking, George? This isn't something you need to be focusing on right now with the benefit concert coming up. Just do it for me, Tom. I need to understand exactly what happened. After ending the call, George stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the Texas landscape he loved so deeply. Rolling hills dotted with live oaks, cattle grazing in the distance. You've got that look, Norma observed. What look? The one you get when you've made up your mind about something and no one's going to change it. George turned to her with a small smile. Remember back in '78 when we were flat broke and living in that tiny apartment? I was ready to give up music completely, go back to teaching agricultural science. And I told you to give it one more year. Norma recalled, returning his smile. Best advice I ever gave. You've always known what was right, even when I couldn't see it myself. He walked over and took her hands in his. I think I've been carrying something all these years without really acknowledging it. Small compromises, decisions that seemed necessary at the time. Most worked out just fine, but some, he trailed off. Some left people like Richard Kelton and his father behind, Norma finished for him. Exactly. George checked his watch. I should head to rehearsal, but afterward I'm going to pay someone a visit. Who? Jerry Billings. He was A&R at MCA back then. Retired now, living out near Fredericksburg. If anyone knows the whole story of what happened with Kelton Studios, it's him. Later that evening, after a productive but subdued rehearsal where his band had noticed his preoccupation but knew better than to pry, George drove through the picturesque hill country as the sun began its descent. The winding roads took him past vineyards and peach orchards to a modest subdivision where Jerry Billings had retired after his decades in the music industry. Inside Jerry's home, comfortable but unassuming with walls adorned with gold records and music memorabilia from his career, the two men settled in the living room with glasses of bourbon. Kelton Studios, George said, getting straight to the point. 1988. I need to know exactly what happened. Jerry's expression shifted, a mixture of recognition and discomfort crossing his weathered features. Ancient history, George. Why are you digging that up now? The former executive, now in his 70s, seemed surprised but pleased when he opened his door to find George Strait on his porch. George, well, I'll be damned, he exclaimed, extending a hand. What brings the king of country to my humble abode? Need to pick your brain about something from the old days, Jerry, George replied, accepting the handshake. Got time for a conversation? George recounted the restaurant confrontation, watching Jerry's reaction carefully. Ah, hell, Jerry sighed, taking a long sip of his drink. Richard Kelton. He was just a kid back then, working for his dad at the studio. Had a big chip on his shoulder even then, thought he knew more than anyone else in the room. But what really happened with the contract? All I remember is being told we needed to record at a different studio, one with more experience handling projects the size of what we were planning. Jerry looked uncomfortable. That was a bit of misdirection on our part, George. Truth is, Kelton Studios was perfectly capable, had top-notch equipment, good engineers, but what? George pressed. But I had a brother-in-law who'd just opened a new recording facility in Nashville. Much bigger operation, lots of overhead. He needed the business. Jerry couldn't quite meet George's eyes. I pushed to move your project there instead, used my influence with the label. Old man Kelton had a signed letter of intent, but we found a loophole. Legal, but not exactly ethical. George felt a heaviness settle in his chest. So, when the label told me it was about studio capabilities, that was a line we fed you, knowing you'd trust our judgment, Jerry admitted. You were still establishing yourself as a major artist. We didn't think you'd question it. And Kelton Studios? Jerry swirled the amber liquid in his glass. Filed for bankruptcy 14 months later. Walter Kelton, Richard's father, he didn't handle it well, started drinking heavily. There was talk he might have taken his own life, though officially it was ruled a heart attack. George set his untouched bourbon on the coffee table, suddenly feeling ill. Why didn't you ever tell me this, Jerry? Would it have changed anything? Jerry countered defensively. You were rising fast, George. Your albums were selling millions. We all did what we had to do in that business. Not all of us, George replied quietly. Not at that cost. The drive back to his ranch was long and contemplative, the Texas night surrounding him with darkness broken only by his headlights and the occasional passing car. Norma had gone to bed, but had left a note on the kitchen counter. Whatever you're thinking of doing, I support you. Always have, always will. George smiled despite his troubled mind. He walked to his study, a wood-paneled room filled with memorabilia from his career, platinum albums, awards, photos with other country legends and presidents alike. He sat at his desk and opened his laptop, beginning to search for information about Richard Kelton. George had built his career on integrity and straightforward dealing. At least that's what he'd always told himself. But had he been willfully blind to the machinations happening around him? Had his focus on musical authenticity blinded him to business realities that hurt people in his wake? When he arrived home, the house was dark, except for a single lamp left on in the living room. The man had indeed done well for himself, building a substantial real estate portfolio across Texas and parts of Tennessee. He was a major investor in several restaurant chains, including Molly's Roadhouse. Articles described him as ruthlessly effective and driven by an almost pathological need to succeed. None mentioned his father or the defunct recording studio that had once been the Kelton family business. George closed the laptop and leaned back in his chair. The path forward was becoming clear to him, though it wouldn't be easy. He picked up his phone and sent a text to Tom. I know what I need to do. Let's talk in the morning. He then walked to the kitchen and retrieved a legal pad, sitting at the counter and beginning to write lyrics that had started forming in his mind on the drive home. Words about regret, responsibility, and the chance for redemption. It was the first time he'd felt inspired to write in months. The next morning brought a clarity that only seemed to come with the Texas sunrise. George sat on his porch, mug of black coffee in hand, watching the golden light spread across his property. He'd slept fitfully, his mind wrestling with revelations from Jerry Billings and the weight of a past he hadn't fully understood until now. Norma joined him, sliding into the rocking chair beside his, her own coffee steaming in the morning chill. "You were up late," she observed. "Had some thinking to do." He passed her the legal pad where he'd been writing the night before, and this came out. She read through the lyrics, her expression softening. "Shadows of Decisions," she read the title aloud. "It's powerful, George. Different from your usual style. It's what's in my heart right now." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Tom Hammond's SUV coming up the driveway. George had called him first thing, asking him to come to the ranch rather than discussing matters over the phone. Tom, a stocky man in his 60s with thinning grey hair and the perpetually harried look of someone who managed big personalities for a living, climbed out of his vehicle carrying a leather portfolio. "Beautiful morning," he called as he approached the porch. "Though I get the feeling I'm not here to admire the scenery." George invited him inside, and the three settled in the kitchen. Norma prepared a fresh pot of coffee, while George outlined what he'd learned from Jerry Billings. Tom whistled low. That's not how the story was told back then. But honestly, it doesn't surprise me. Jerry always had a reputation for taking care of family first, artists second. "I want to make it right," George stated simply. "Make it right?" Tom looked concerned. "George, this was over 3 decades ago. Walter Kelton is dead. His son clearly doesn't want your apology. He wanted to humiliate you, and he succeeded. I've already been fielding calls from people who were at the restaurant. It's only a matter of time before it hits social media." "Let it," George said with a shrug. "I'm not worried about that." "Well, I am. That's my job." Tom pulled some papers from his portfolio. "I did the research you asked for. Kelton Studios was formally dissolved in 1990. The building was sold to developers. Torn down, now it's a parking garage in downtown Nashville." "And the family? Beyond Richard?" Tom consulted his notes. "Walter's widow, Richard's mother, is still alive. Martha Kelton, 83, lives in an assisted living facility in Franklin, Tennessee. There's a sister, too, Catherine Kelton Reed. She's a high school music teacher in Austin, actually." This information captured George's attention. "In Austin? Does she have any connection to Richard's businesses?" "None that I could find. From what I gather, they're not close. She kept the Kelton name professionally but seems to have distanced herself otherwise." George nodded thoughtfully. "Here's what I want to do, Tom." Over the next half hour, he outlined a plan that left his manager alternately shaking his head in disbelief and reluctantly admitting it might actually work. "This is either the most generous thing I've ever heard or the craziest," Tom finally said. "You understand there's no guarantee Richard Kelton will respond positively. He might just take it as another opportunity to attack you publicly. That's a risk I'm willing to take." Tom turned to Norma. "Talk some sense into him, would you?" She smiled, placing a hand on George's arm. "When he gets that determined look, there's no changing his mind. Besides, I think he's right." "Of course you do," Tom sighed. "You two have always been in perfect harmony, even when the tune makes no business sense." Despite his protests, there was affection in his voice. He'd been with George long enough to know that the singer's moral compass had guided him well over the years. "Start with the sister," George suggested. "Catherine. She might be more receptive, and she could help us approach Richard in the right way." "I'll track her down today," Tom promised, gathering his notes. "But George, the benefit concert is in 3 days. Are you sure you want to be dealing with all this right now?" "I'm sure. In fact, I think the timing couldn't be better." After Tom left, George spent the morning in his home studio, working on the new song he'd written during the night. The melody had come to him almost fully formed, unusual for his writing process, which typically involved more deliberation. This one had emerged from somewhere deep, a place of genuine remorse and hope. By late afternoon, Tom called with news. He'd located Catherine Kelton Reid and made initial contact, explaining that George Strait wished to speak with her about a personal matter concerning her family. To everyone's surprise, she had agreed to meet the following day. She seemed cautious but not hostile, Tom reported. Said she'd been at one of your concerts last year, actually. Apparently, she's something of a fan, despite the family history. The next day, George drove to Austin alone, despite Tom's insistence on accompanying him. This was a personal matter, he'd explained, not a business negotiation that required management presence. Catherine Kelton Reid had suggested meeting at a small coffee shop near the high school where she taught music. As George entered the modestly furnished establishment, he immediately spotted her sitting in a corner booth. A woman in her mid-40s with dark hair streaked with grey, pulled back in a practical ponytail, grading papers while sipping from an oversized mug. He approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. "Miss Kelton Reid, I'm George Strait." She looked up, and George could immediately see the family resemblance to Richard, the same determined set of the jaw, though her eyes held warmth rather than resentment. "Mr. Strait," she said, gesturing to the seat across from her. "I have to admit, I was skeptical when your manager called. I thought it might be some kind of prank." "No prank, ma'am. And please, call me George." "Then I'm Catherine." She set aside her grading, studying him curiously. "I heard about what happened at Molly's with my brother. It's all over the local music community." George nodded, accepting a coffee from the waitress who approached their table. "That's partly why I wanted to talk with you. I've recently learned some things about what happened with your father's studio back in '88, things I didn't know at the time." Catherine's expression turned guarded. "That was a difficult period for our family. Dad's studio was everything to him." "I understand that now, more than I did then," George said sincerely. "I was told yesterday that the decision to pull my recording project from Kelton Studios wasn't about capability at all. It was nepotism at the label, something I wasn't aware of." Her eyes widened slightly. "That's not the story Richard has always told. He believes you personally betrayed Dad, chose fame and fortune over loyalty to a smaller studio that had given you a chance. I can see why he would think that. The truth is, I was still learning the business side of music then. I trusted my label's judgment, didn't ask enough questions." George leaned forward. "I can't change what happened, but I'd like to try to make amends, if that's possible." Catherine sipped her coffee thoughtfully. "Richard has carried this grudge for so long, it's become part of who he is. After Dad died, he channeled all that anger into proving himself in business. He's been successful, but never happy. Not really." "And your mother, how did she handle it all?" A flicker of sadness passed over Catherine's features. "Mom tried to keep us together. She's always been the strong one. Even now, in assisted living with her health failing, she's more concerned about Richard and me than herself." George nodded, taking this in. "Catherine, I have an idea, but I'll need your help. It involves your brother, your mother, and a song I've just written. I brought a rough recording." He pulled out his phone and a small portable speaker, "Just a demo I recorded this morning." As the song played in the quiet corner of the coffee shop, Catherine Kelton Reid listened intently, her eyes gradually filling with tears. When the final notes faded, she wiped her cheeks. That's our story, Dad's story." "It's my story too," George said quietly. As he outlined his plan, Catherine's expression shifted from skepticism to cautious interest. By the time he finished explaining, she was nodding slowly. "It's unconventional," she admitted. "Richard might reject it outright. But if he doesn't, it could be exactly what our family has needed for a very long time." She straightened in her seat, making a decision. "All right, George Strait. I'll help you. But I want to hear this song first." George smiled. "I was hoping you'd say that." A reminder that success comes with responsibility, and sometimes we don't realize the impact of our choices until years later. Catherine took a deep breath. "I'll call Richard tonight. I can't promise he'll listen, but I'll try. That's all I can ask for. And one more thing, if he does agree, I'd like to arrange for your mother to be there too. Is that possible?" "It would mean a lot to her," Catherine acknowledged. "She always loved your music, you know. Even after everything that happened, used to say there was an honesty in your voice that couldn't be faked." As they parted outside the coffee shop, Catherine surprised George with a brief hug. "Whatever happens with Richard, thank you for this. Some wounds don't heal until they're properly acknowledged." George drove back to his ranch with a mixture of hope and apprehension. The foundation had been laid, but the most difficult conversation was yet to come. That evening, he received a text from Catherine. "He'll meet tomorrow 2 p.m., his office in downtown Austin. He says you get 15 minutes. That's all I could negotiate." It was a start. The gleaming high-rise in downtown Austin that housed Kelton Investments stood in stark contrast to the honky-tonk bars and music venues that had made the city famous. Glass and steel reached skyward, a monument to commercial success that Richard Kelton had built from the ashes of his father's failed music business. George arrived 10 minutes early, dressed in a crisp white shirt, dark jeans, and a sport coat, respectable without being overly formal. The receptionist's eyes widened in recognition as he approached. "Mr. Strait, are you here to see Mr. Kelton?" "Yes, ma'am. I believe he's expecting me." She quickly made a call, speaking in hushed tones, then directed George to the elevator. "21st floor, his assistant will meet you." The executive suite of Kelton Investments exuded power and wealth. Modern furniture in muted tones, abstract art on the walls, floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of the city. A young woman in a tailored suit greeted him professionally, though her eyes betrayed her excitement at meeting the country star. "Mr. Kelton will see you now," she said, leading him to a large corner office. Richard Kelton stood as George entered, his posture stiff and unwelcoming. He was dressed impeccably in a custom suit that probably cost more than most people earned in a month. Behind him, Austin sprawled out in all directions, a kingdom he could survey from his lofty perch. "Strait," he acknowledged coolly. "My sister can be very persuasive when she wants to be." "I appreciate you agreeing to meet," George replied, extending his hand. Richard hesitated before briefly shaking it, gesturing to a chair across from his desk. 15 minutes. I'm curious what you think you can accomplish in that time that would make any difference after 33 years. George took a seat, studying the man across from him. Despite his obvious success, Richard Kelton's face bore the tight lines of someone who rarely smiled, his eyes carrying the weight of old pain. "I spoke with Jerry Billings yesterday," George began. "He told me what really happened with your father's studio, how the label manipulated the situation to benefit his brother-in-law's new facility." A flicker of surprise crossed Richard's features before his mask of indifference returned. "And you expect me to believe you knew nothing about this until now?" "I didn't ask the right questions back then," George admitted. "I was focused on the music, trusted the business decisions to others. That was my mistake." Richard leaned back in his chair. "So you've come to clear your conscience. How convenient." "No," George replied firmly. "I've come to acknowledge a wrong and try to make it right, not just with words, but with action." "What action could possibly make up for what happened to my father? Do you know what it's like to watch someone you admire, someone who built something from nothing, lose everything? To see them drown their disappointment day after day until it kills them?" The raw emotion in Richard's voice cut through his carefully constructed veneer of success. This wasn't the calculated businessman who had confronted George in the restaurant. This was the wounded son who had never stopped grieving. "I can't imagine that pain," George acknowledged quietly, "and I can't bring your father back, but I can honor his legacy in a way that might help heal some of those wounds." Richard's expression hardened. "I don't need your money, Strait. I've built something 10 times bigger than my father's studio ever was." "This isn't about money," George assured him. "It's about recognition and remembrance." He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a USB drive, placing it on the desk between them. "I've written a song about your father, about what happened, about the cost of success that sometimes isn't counted." Richard stared at the drive as if it might bite him. "A song? That's your solution?" "It's called Shadows of Decisions. I'd like you to listen to it, and if you approve, I want to debut it at the benefit concert this weekend, with full acknowledgement of its origins and Walter Kelton's contribution to the Nashville music scene." "A public apology wrapped in a PR moment," Richard scoffed. "How generous of you." George shook his head. "No cameras, no press release, just the truth, shared with people who love country music, and something else." He pulled out a folded document from his inner pocket. "This is a proposal to establish the Walter Kelton Music Education Foundation with an initial endowment of $1 million. I'd like your mother to be the honorary chairperson, with you and Catherine on the board if you're willing." Richard's expression faltered for the first time, genuine surprise breaking through. What would this foundation do exactly? Support young musicians and small recording studios, provide scholarships, keep the spirit of what your father was trying to build alive. George slid the proposal across the desk. "And I'd like to record my next album at a small, independent studio chosen by the foundation board. That first album would be dedicated to Walter's memory." For several moments, Richard said nothing, his eyes fixed on the proposal. When he finally looked up, the hostility had drained from his face, replaced by something more complex, a mixture of skepticism and cautious interest. "Why now, Strait, after all these years?" "Because sometimes it takes a hard confrontation to see what's been in front of you all along," George answered honestly. "You did me a favor at that restaurant, Richard. You made me face something I should have addressed decades ago." The ghost of a smile touched Richard's lips. "So I should feel good about dumping ice water in your lap?" "I've had worse welcomes in some honky-tonks back in my early days," George replied, with a slight smile of his own. Richard picked up the USB drive, turning it over in his fingers. "My mother is coming to Austin tomorrow. Catherine arranged it before telling me about this meeting. Apparently my sister has more faith in redemption stories than I do. Would you be willing to listen to the song with them, all 3 of you together?" Richard considered this for a long moment. "I'll discuss it with my mother and sister." It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either. As George left the office building and stepped into the bright Austin afternoon, he felt lighter than he had in days. The path to reconciliation had been opened, narrow and uncertain, but real. That evening, he received a text from Catherine. "We listened to the song," Mom cried. Richard didn't, but he stayed in the room. "They want to come to the concert. I'm not making any promises, Strait, but yes, we can listen to it." As George stood to leave, having stayed exactly 15 minutes as promised, Richard remained seated, studying the proposal. "One more thing," George said at the door. "I'd like to invite all 3 of you to the benefit concert. Backstage passes, private entrance. No obligation beyond that. Just a chance to hear the song performed live, if you approve it." Richard looked up, his expression unreadable. George showed the message to Norma, who smiled and kissed his cheek. "I'm proud of you," she said simply. The day of the benefit concert arrived, bringing perfect weather to Austin, clear skies and a gentle breeze that tempered the summer heat. The Irwin Center was sold out, with proceeds going to support drought-affected ranchers across Texas, families fighting to preserve their way of life against increasingly challenging climate conditions. At 6 o'clock, an hour before doors opened to the public, Tom arrived with the Kelton family in tow. Martha Kelton in a wheelchair guided by Catherine, Richard walking slightly behind them, his expression guarded but not openly hostile. George greeted them warmly, taking special care with Martha, a dignified woman whose frail appearance belied the strength in her clear blue eyes. "Mr. Strait," she said, taking his hand in both of hers, "I want to thank you for what you're doing." Backstage was the controlled chaos typical of major performances. Crew members making final adjustments to equipment, band members warming up, catering staff arranging food and drinks in the green room. George spent the afternoon in quiet preparation, reviewing the set list with his band and explaining the addition of the new song. "It's personal," he told them. "Might be a bit rough since we've only had a couple of rehearsals with it, but sometimes the meaning matters more than the polish." Walter would have appreciated it, whatever Richard might say to the contrary. "Mother," Richard murmured, embarrassed. Martha waved off his concern. "Oh, hush, Richard. I'm too old for pretense. George has extended an olive branch, and we're here to accept it properly." George smiled. "I'm honored you came, Mrs. Kelton, all of you." He gave them a brief tour of the backstage area, introducing them to band members and crew. Richard remained quiet throughout, observing everything with the calculating eye of a successful businessman. But occasionally, when he thought no one was looking, his expression softened as he watched his mother's obvious enjoyment of the experience. In a quiet moment before the show, George found Richard standing alone, gazing at a collection of framed photographs on the wall. Images of legendary country performers who had played the venue over the decades. "My father should have been part of all this," Richard said without looking at George. "He had an ear for talent like no one else. Could have been one of the great producers if he'd had the chance." "Tell me about him," George requested. "The man, not just the studio owner." Richard was silent for so long that George thought he might not answer. But then, almost reluctantly, he began to speak. "He used to bring me to the studio when I was a kid. Let me sit in on sessions, taught me how to work the soundboard. Said music was like alchemy, turning feelings into sound, then back into feelings again." A ghost of a smile crossed Richard's face. He wore these ridiculous cowboy boots in the studio, bright red with silver tips. Said they helped him feel the rhythm through the floor. Sounds like someone who truly loved the craft. He did. Richard finally turned to look at George. That's what made losing it all so hard. It wasn't just a business to him. "The foundation won't bring him back," George acknowledged, "but it might help others with that same passion find their way." The conversation was interrupted by Tom announcing it was 30 minutes to showtime. George needed to finish preparing, and the Keltons were escorted to their special reserved seats in the front section. The concert began with George's familiar hits, the audience singing along to Amarillo by Morning, The Chair, and All My Exes Live in Texas. The energy in the arena was electric, a community united by music and the cause of supporting their fellow Texans in need. 2/3 of the way through the set, George stepped to the microphone during a brief pause. The house lights dimmed slightly as he spoke. "I'd like to share something new with y'all tonight," he said, his voice carrying across the hushed arena. "This song was born from a confrontation that happened to me just a few days ago. A moment that made me look back at choices made over 30 years ago and recognize their consequences." He explained briefly about Walter Kelton and his Nashville studio, about how business decisions sometimes cast long shadows, and how acknowledging past wrongs can open doors to healing. This song is called Shadows of Decisions, and it's dedicated to the memory of Walter Kelton, whose family is here with us tonight. A single spotlight illuminated the Keltons in the front row. Martha sat straight in her wheelchair, Catherine's hand resting on her shoulder. Richard, to everyone's surprise, stood and acknowledged the audience with a slight nod before sitting back down. The band began to play the haunting melody, and George's voice filled the arena with lyrics of regret, recognition, and the hope for redemption. The song spoke of paths not taken, of how success for some can mean loss for others, and the importance of looking back honestly at the wake we leave behind us. As the final notes faded, there was a moment of complete silence before the audience erupted in applause. George looked toward the Kelton family. Martha was openly weeping, Catherine comforting her, and Richard, the man who had dumped ice water in George's lap just days earlier, stood again, making deliberate eye contact with George. Then, slowly and deliberately, he raised his hands and joined in the applause. After the concert concluded with a rousing encore of fan favorites, the Keltons joined George in his dressing room. Martha approached him first, her eyes still bright with emotion. "You've given Walter back his dignity," she said simply. "I can't thank you enough for that." Catherine hugged George warmly. "That was beautiful, truly." Richard hung back, seemingly wrestling with his emotions. Finally, he stepped forward and extended his hand. "The foundation," he said as they shook hands. "I'd like to match your endowment. 1 million from you, 1 million from me. And I know some other investors who might be interested as well. I'd like that very much." As the Keltons prepared to leave, Martha asked for a moment alone with George. Richard and Catherine stepped outside, giving them privacy. "My husband would have forgiven you long ago," the elderly woman told him. "He wasn't one to hold grudges, but our son, he's carried this weight for so long, it became part of him." She patted George's hand. "You've given Richard something I've been praying for, a chance to let go of that burden. I hope he takes it." George's surprise must have shown on his face because Richard actually smiled, the first genuine smile George had seen from him. "Don't look so shocked, Strait. I can recognize a good idea when I hear one, even if I don't particularly like where it came from at first." "I appreciate that, Richard, more than you know." "I'm not saying we're going to be best friends," Richard clarified, "but maybe we can build something positive from all this, for my father's legacy." "He will," Martha said confidently. "It might take time, but tonight was a beginning." Outside the Irwin Center, as fans dispersed into the warm Texas night, word was already spreading about the new George Strait song and the story behind it. What had begun as an embarrassing public confrontation was transforming into something unexpected, a narrative of reconciliation that resonated with people far beyond those directly involved. For George, driving home to his ranch with Norma beside him, there was a sense of having closed a circle that had been left open for far too long. The path ahead with the Kelton family and the new foundation would have its challenges, but the first step, the hardest step, had been taken. "You did good," Norma said softly, her hand on his as he drove. "Really good." "It felt right," George replied. "Long overdue, but right." In the rearview mirror, the lights of Austin receded behind them. Ahead lay home, and beyond that, the promise of something new growing from the reconciliation of a long-buried past. 6 months later, on a crisp January morning, George stood before a renovated storefront in East Nashville, surrounded by a small crowd of media, music industry professionals, and curious onlookers. Beside him stood the Kelton family, Martha in her wheelchair, Catherine smiling proudly, and Richard looking somewhat uncomfortable in the spotlight, but present nonetheless. "Today marks not just the opening of a studio," George said into the microphones arranged before him, "but the renewal of a vision that Walter Kelton had over 3 decades ago, creating a space where music can be captured in its most authentic form, where new talent can find its voice." The month since the benefit concert had brought unexpected developments. The story of the reconciliation between George Strait and the Kelton family had resonated deeply within the country music community. The building they faced bore a freshly painted sign, Kelton Legacy Studios, where tradition meets tomorrow. It was the first tangible project of the Walter Kelton Music Education Foundation, a recording facility dedicated to supporting independent artists and providing hands-on experience for music production students. Artists who had worked with Walter in the early days came forward with their own stories, creating a fuller picture of the man whose career had been cut short. Richard, to everyone's surprise, had thrown himself into the foundation work with characteristic intensity, but now channeling his business acumen toward building something rather than nursing old grievances. He and George had developed a wary respect for each other, their initial antagonism gradually giving way to a professional partnership focused on honoring Walter's legacy. "My father believed that music wasn't just about commercial success," Richard said, taking his turn at the microphones. "He believed it was about capturing moments of truth. This studio is dedicated to that principle." He glanced at George. "Sometimes those moments of truth take decades to recognize, but when they do, they have the power to transform." After the ribbon-cutting ceremony, guests toured the facility, admiring the blend of vintage equipment salvaged from various Nashville studios of Walter's era and cutting-edge technology. One room had been designated the Walter Kelton Memorial Archive, housing photographs, documents, and recordings from his career. In a quiet corner, George found Martha Kelton looking at a black-and-white photograph of her late husband, a younger Walter standing proudly in front of his original studio, arms crossed, a pair of ridiculous red cowboy boots visible beneath his jeans. "He would have loved this," Martha said, sensing George's presence. Not the attention, necessarily, but knowing his work mattered enough to be remembered. "Your family has built something remarkable here," George replied. "I'm just grateful to be a small part of it." Martha smiled up at him. "Not so small. Richard would never admit it, but you've given him something he's needed for a very long time, a purpose beyond just making money." Across the room, Richard was engaged in animated conversation with several music students who had been selected for the Foundation's first scholarship program. His usual stern demeanor had softened as he explained something about analog recording techniques, his hands gesturing enthusiastically. "He looks like Walter when he talks about music," Martha observed. "That passion was always there, just buried under the hurt." The studio's opening day culminated in an impromptu jam session in the main recording space. George, who had brought his guitar, joined several other musicians in playing a mix of classics and new material. Catherine, who had inherited her father's musical talents, contributed vocals on a few songs. To everyone's astonishment, Richard eventually picked up a bass guitar that had been leaning against the wall. When questioned looks came his way, he shrugged. "Dad taught me the basics when I was 14, he explained. "Haven't played much since, but some things you don't forget." As the informal session continued, George suggested they play "Shadows of Decisions," the song that had sparked this unlikely reconciliation. The room quieted as the first notes began, the song taking on new meaning in this space, dedicated to Walter's memory. Midway through, George noticed Richard discreetly wiping his eyes while continuing to play the bass line. Their eyes met briefly over the music, an unspoken acknowledgement passing between them. The recognition that healing had begun, not just for the Kelton family, but for George himself. Later that evening, after most guests had departed, George found himself sitting with Richard in the studio's small kitchenette, sharing coffee and conversation more comfortably than either would have thought possible 6 months earlier. "This was never about publicity for you, was it?" Richard asked suddenly. "When you approached us after the restaurant incident, I was convinced it was just damage control." George shook his head. It was about setting something right that had been wrong for too long. The music business gave me a blessed life, but sometimes success can blind you to the ripple effects of decisions made along the way. Richard nodded slowly. I've been thinking about that a lot lately. My own business practices. He trailed off, looking uncomfortable. Let's just say I've made my share of ruthless moves, called it necessary, part of the game. But now I'm wondering who else might have been hurt in my wake. Richard's fingers traced the rim of his coffee mug. I've got some reflecting to do. The conversation shifted to plans for the Foundation's future, mentorship programs, recording opportunities for promising artists who couldn't afford studio time, preservation of Nashville's musical heritage. As they talked, it became clear that what had begun as an act of reconciliation had evolved into a partnership built on shared values about music and its importance. You know, Richard said as they were preparing to leave, I actually had one of your albums in college. Never told anyone, of course. Would have ruined my reputation as the guy who hated George Strait. George laughed. Which album? Oceanfront Property. Your dad brought it home. Said I should listen to how you phrased your vocals, regardless of our history. He was like that. Could separate the art from the business conflicts. Sounds like a wise man. One I wish I'd had the chance to know better. Outside, the Nashville night was alive with music drifting from nearby venues, the heartbeat of a city built on songs. As they parted ways, Richard extended his hand. Thank you, he said simply. Not just for the foundation or the studio, for not giving up when I made it as difficult as possible. Some things are worth the effort, George replied as they shook hands. Your father's legacy is definitely one of them. 3 weeks later, George was back in his home studio in Texas, working with his band on material for a new album, the one he had promised would be recorded at an independent studio chosen by the Kelton Foundation. The song that had sparked the reconciliation, Shadows of Decisions, would be the title track. As they took a break between songs, Tom arrived with news. Just got off the phone with Billboard, he announced. The single is officially top 10 on the country chart. Not bad for a song that's different from your usual style. George nodded, pleased but not surprised. The song had connected with listeners in a way that transcended typical radio fare, its honesty about mistakes and redemption resonating in a world where public figures rarely acknowledged either. There's something else, Tom continued, handing George a manila envelope. Richard Kelton sent this over by courier, said it was something his mother found while going through old storage boxes. Inside was a cassette tape labeled in faded handwriting. George Strait, Demo Session, Kelton Studios, 1987. With it was a note in Richard's precise handwriting. George, Mother found this while organizing Dad's things for the archive. The first student recording sessions start next week, she told him excitedly. We've got 5 young songwriters coming in. Richard has been practically living at the studio, making sure everything is perfect. How's your mother doing? George asked. Better than she has in years. The foundation has given her something to focus on beyond her health issues. She's been sorting through Dad's records and memorabilia for the archive, telling stories I've never heard before. Catherine paused. Appears to be from your very first visit to Kelton Studios, before any label contracts. Dad apparently kept it all these years. Thought you might want to have it. RK. George held the cassette carefully, a physical link to the past they'd been working to reconcile. We'll need to get this transferred digitally for the archive, he said quietly. Later that week, as the first snow of the season dusted his Texas ranch, George received a call from Catherine. She says it feels like he's present again, in a way that's not painful anymore. After the call, George walked out onto his porch, watching snowflakes drift down onto the winter-brown pasture. In the distance, a few of his horses gathered near the fence line, their breath visible in the cold air. The journey from that confrontation at Molly's Roadhouse to today had been unexpected in every way. As George turned to go in, he took one last look at the winter landscape of the ranch that success had built. Success that had come with responsibilities he hadn't always recognized. The path forward was clearer now, informed by lessons from the past, but not constrained by them. The confrontation at that restaurant hadn't been the end of something, as it had seemed that hot summer day when he'd walked out with wet clothes and wounded pride. What had begun with humiliation and anger had transformed into something healing and constructive, a reminder that it's never too late to address the past and change its legacy. George's phone buzzed with a text from Richard. "Just heard from Sony. 3 more artists want to record at Kelton Legacy for their upcoming projects. This thing might actually work." George smiled as he typed his reply. Never doubted it for a minute. Inside, Norma called that dinner was ready. Instead, it had been the beginning, an uncomfortable but necessary first step toward healing wounds that had festered for decades. Sometimes, George reflected as he headed inside to join his wife, the most important journeys begin with the most difficult moments. And sometimes, what shocks everyone is not the conflict itself, but the reconciliation that follows, the human capacity to transform old pain into new purpose. In Nashville, the lights of Kelton Legacy Studios glowed warmly in the darkness, a beacon for new talent and a testament to what can grow from honest reckoning with the past. In that light, both George Strait and the Kelton family had found something unexpected, not just reconciliation but renewal. As Walter Kelton might have said in his ridiculous red boots, sometimes the most powerful music comes from the notes you didn't realize you needed to play.